I just messed up with, thank you very much. Well, welcome back, gang. What a great turnout, thank you. This is, normally Kevin gets us started in the State of Grace Forum, so I don't have my patter down pat, but very glad to have you here and glad to be learning about how this building got started, which is, we're coming up on 100 years in the Space 1926, and really cool to be learning about that. Before we get into Nancy's presentation, Liz, do you want to give a wee update on security with Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff and I can give a wee update on security. I will say the de-escalation training happened on Wednesday. There were about 18 of us. It was a really great start, and we will put something together. So hopefully there will be more.
We're also working on finalizing the emergency response guide, which is about 35 pages. We don't expect everybody to read all of that. So we'll be taking the most important information and condensing them down to probably 2 one-pagers, one of which will focus on emergencies, one of which will focus on de-escalation and what we've learned from the de-escalation training. So.
Yeah, our team is going strong, and we did another walk around in terms of building and grounds, and we'll continue to work in coordination with building and grounds to make our land as safe and secure as possible.
Yeah, just along those lines, it probably is not going to be possible to replace all of the locks with the electronic locks. The price will probably be beyond our reach. So what we're doing now is trying to prioritize which locks need to be either replaced or upgraded to provide a more secure environment.
And the final thing is, and I say this especially for the vestry, is that we are really discussing about security and what that looks like, and so more to come.
Thank you very much, Liz and Jeff. This is really wonderful work and important work. How does one do a transition like this? I'm excited to hear what you have to share, Nancy. There's been really cool work that you and the rest of the archive team have been doing, discovering all these letters and photographs and other documents from Grace's history, and there's just been such rich things taking place here. Thank you for doing that work, and we're excited to hear what you've got to share this morning. People of Grace, it's Nancy Andrican.
I would like to introduce my companions in this effort. You guys all have to come forward. About a year ago, I think Sally and I had some real frustration trying to find old records. Sometimes the development committee wanted to know something like, was there ever a gas station on this block? Things like that. Digging through these boxes of stuff. So we decided maybe we can organize this. And at some point I said, you know, this isn't going to take a few months. This is going to take several years. And I think a year in, I don't know, maybe even more than several. But this is Avril. Hi. Kathy Gibson, Sally Frazier, Avril Johnson. I didn't get her last name.
There's only one Avril.
There's only one Avril in the whole world.
In the whole world, yeah.
And we've just really enjoyed working, well, we like each other a lot. So it's real fun to come down and, you know, just be in our little room and read things to each other that we think are hilarious. And Kathy's going to finish up the talk today with some newly discovered information. Thank you, guys. So next, I'd like to thank Dan for his sermon today about building things. That was so perfect. Now, we're not quite in the league of rebuilding a city, and it isn't quite as heavy of a message, but thank you. This gets confusing. I know I confuse myself sometimes going through it, so I'm going to kind of break it into 4 sections for you to think about before I actually start into the details. The first section goes back before 1908 to about 1870, when Frederick Berry came to Portland and then married Angeline Anderson in 1883, and then they moved to Portland in 1884. And some of their early years in Portland, up to the time of Frederick's death in 1906. So that's the first section. The second section will be this, simmering idea to have another Episcopal church on this side of the river. And Angeline's desire to have a memorial for her husband and the money she gave that bought this property we're on right now. And then the tent house and the parish house in the early years of the church up to 2018. And in 2018, things started to move along. Capital Campaign Committee, which they didn't call it then, but a fundraising group for the new church was formed. And then in 1919, a building committee, the search for an architect. And the big overriding thing in all of this was Angeline's deed and the restrictions in her deed and how that complicated things and what they did to try to get those restrictions removed. Well, that all kind of settled around what the possibilities really were in 1920. And then the last section is 1920 to 1925. They were raising money for the church. And they realized they wouldn't have enough to build the original plan. And they made some cutbacks. The congregation decided that was okay, and the building began in 1925, and the church was finished in 26 and dedicated in January of 1926. So, what'd I do with my clicker? Oh, here it is. So Frederick Berry came to the US from Sussex, England in 1870. As a 13-year-old, he had some health problems. And so the solution to that, I guess, was to put him on a merchant ship and send him on a year-long journey. So he was gone for a year and he came back and he was so much better, and he talked his parents into letting him continue that. So from 13 years old to 20 years old, he was sailing around on merchant ships. He came home in about 1920 and married a woman. They had a little girl, and then his wife died. The little girl was sent to live with his aunt, and to recover, what did Frederick Berry do? He took a ship trip to South Africa for a year. And he did that until, I don't know when he stopped, but he ended up living in New York City. He moved there in 1870. And I think, if I figured it out right, he was 27 at that time. So he was probably on ships. He was looking for a business. I know there was a little foray into asbestos, a little foray into rubber, different things that he discovered in all of his journeys. And somewhere along the line, he met Angeline. And Angeline was a school principal in Sherritt, Pennsylvania. The Sherritt School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I don't know how they met. We've come across nothing that would describe that yet. But they got married in 1883. Angeline was 40. Frederick was 42. And they immediately moved to Portland the next year. And there's nothing that says why. I did read that the last leg of the train across the United States from Biggs Junction to Portland was finished in 1883. So in my mind, I imagine that they read that and they said, wow, the train goes to Portland, let's move there. whatever the case, they did move here, and they purchased a home at 600 Southeast Oak. There were two Episcopal churches on this side of the river, St. John's in Milwaukee, St. David's in Southeast Portland. And they were members of St. John's for 25 years. Members of St. David's. And thank you, Avril, very much. And Frederick was a vestryman there for 19 of those years. Frederick died in 1906. So that's the end of our first section. I think I'm forgetting my slides. So here we have Frederick and Angeline. We've got a lovely picture of Frederick, but there are no really good pictures of Angeline. Around that time at St. David's, there was a new bishop, Bishop Scadling, I think is how you say it, and they were envisioning another church on this side of the river, and they thought Irvington was a good place. And Angeline got involved in that, and Dr. Reverend Van Waters was then the rector of St. David's. So he retired from St. David's, and Angeline offered to give $5,000 to purchase some land for the new church. Now, I looked this up. $100 in 1908 is equivalent to $3,226 today. So that was actually quite a lot of money. She gave this money on the condition that it would, this whole thing would be handled by Reverend Dr. Van Waters. The bishop was really interested in properties on Knott. I think it was a fancier area than here. And they looked there, but the zoning on Knott didn't allow for saloons, fire halls, or churches. Because why would it, right? So with that out of the question, in December 1908, Angeline, who was then 65, purchased lots 7 and 8 of the block where we are right now. And she wanted a church to be built there in memory of her husband, Frederick Barry, and to be called Grace Memorial Episcopal Protestant Church. So the bishop sent, this is hopeless, you can't read that. The bishop sent her a letter congratulating her on this purchase, and he had to mention that he would really have preferred that this church be on Knott. So he had a little trouble getting rid of that idea. So shortly after the purchase in December, a tent house was set up. Here I've got a picture of the tent house, and I think you've all seen this, and Angeline financed this. And the first service was held in January 1909. There was an architect on the vestry at that time, and he was designing a parish hall. And by June of that year, the parish, they called it the parish house, was built. And they moved into there for their services. And they actually stayed in that parish house until this church was built. Excuse me? Oh, the parish house. Do you think that's the Grace house right next to it? Or the Fame house? I don't know. The houses got torn down and moved around a lot back then. Okay, so now we're in 1909. They're worshiping in the parish house. And between 1909 and 1918, it was kind of like the church was growing. And we sit down and we read the old vestry minutes where they're approving bills for $4.20 for this and that. And it just seems incredible to us, but money was worth a lot more then. So things started heating up. This is I think our third period. It's going to be 1918 and 1919. And a committee was formed to start raising funds in 1918. And then in May of 1919, another committee was appointed to secure an architect to draft plans to submit to the vestry, and they really, really picked a good one. This is Ellis Lawrence, and I've just become a huge fan of his. And I found out last Sunday that that Gail owned a Lawrence house. Was it called the Bishop House, did you say? Yeah. He designed a lot of single home houses around Portland. He lived on 21st, and sometimes I park in front of his house and think about him. He designed the Presbyterian Church. He designed St. Michael's and All Angels, Mahonia Hall, MacArthur Court, the Jordan Schnitzer Museum at the U of O. He started the architectural school at the U of O. And he didn't have one certain way he designed, like, say, Frank Lloyd Wright did. He could design in any kind of way you wanted. And his buildings are all just, I don't know about MacArthur Court, but they're really all beautiful. Sally and I went to a performance at the Elsinore Theater in Salem that he designed, and I don't remember what the performance was, but I sure remember that theater. We were really taken with it. So these are not gonna come across very well, but we're getting all the blueprints scanned so that you could look at them more in detail. This shows a view, I think, kind of on Weidler, looking at the church. And he designed it with the most intricately beautiful, I'm not a brick fan, but brick. It was gorgeous. And you'd have to get closer to see the detail of the brickwork on that. So these plans were taken to the vestry June 2nd, 1990. They were approved, and they said, go ahead and get plans configured and get estimates. At the same meeting, and this is where it kind of gets a little complicated, they moved to have all the conditions of the deed of the property removed. So what were these conditions? This is just a blow-up of the deed that I found in the old vestry ledger. And I'm going to read to you, it had a lot of conditions, but I'll read to you the one that was problematic for the vestry. The property was, and now I'm in quotes, and it's kind of not written well, so that's not me. The church was to be used solely for the purposes of the Protestant Episcopal Church. And if at any time said property should be used for any other, or become encumbered in any way, manner, by liens, mortgages, judgments of debt of any nature or character, accepting assessments for street improvements, it goes on and on about street improvements, then the title to said property shall immediately revert to the said Angeline Berry, her heirs or assigns, without process of law. So where does this come from? Why is she so against liens on the church? Well, when she was at St. David's, I've read two different accounts. One is that they mortgaged the church and struggled for years to pay it off, kind of putting them on the edge for a long time. Another account is that they mortgaged the church and lost it. So I need to go to St. David's. It's now in Colonial Heights, St. David's of Wales. Wales, not Wales. Anyway, it's now in Colonial Heights, and I'm sure that they could give me the correct answer to what had happened, but it really impacted her. And one of the problems they had with this deed, and it's hard to see, but in the top right-hand corner, you see lots 8 and then 7 below it. The church didn't fit on those lots. So they were thinking they would buy 1 and 20 feet of 2 and put the church on that side, which would be the more traditional way to have the church, because our church is kind of backwards, right, Paul? So they were trying to do that, and they asked attorney for his opinion on whether most of the church was on 1 and 2, would they be able to mortgage it? And he said, not really. I mean, you can't take off 20 feet of the church and not mortgage that 20 feet. So they were kind of stuck there. Okay. I'm getting lost myself. So they called a meeting of the congregation. Apparently, the Fraser property was for sale, which was lot 1 and 18 feet of lot 2. And it was ready for sale right then. They didn't have the money to build the church, so Mrs. Blythe said she could buy the property and hold it until they were ready. But they didn't give up. Even though she actually went ahead and bought the property, they continued pressuring Angeline Berry about what they referred to as the flaw in the deed. At the July 17th meeting, they sent a message to the bishop, and that time it was Bishop Sumner, to enlist his help in removing the restrictions. And this is the plea. I don't know if I typed this one out. Unable to commence work at Grace Memorial, deed and same commission, we want your help and presence. And he was in Port Orford. That's where they sent this telegram. And then in September of 1919, the vestry went to see Angeline to try to persuade her to change the deed. And there was no mention of the bishop attending this meeting. And they came back empty-handed, which they reported in the next month's vestry meetings. So they decided on another angle. This is, of course, Steeplejack, home of Kevin Welsh's office, in case you don't know. They thought maybe they could just buy this property and not do any of this other stuff. And they sent Ellis Lawrence to take a look at it. And he had just a long litany of problems he saw with it. And then he also said that with his work with the city, whatever it was, some city group, he knew that Broadway would become one way and that the intersection would be around that church and that it would lose a lot of land on two sides, which it did. I mean, you're right up next to the church. So after that report, they went back to Plan A, which was Mrs. Blythe's property she'd bought, and decided they wouldn't try to mortgage the church. So that takes us kind of to the end of the complicated period of the deed and all of that. I do know that after they went to see Angeline and put this pressure on her, like in a month, they went back to see her and asked her if she was going to give them $10,000. She said, gee whiz, all of my money is tied up in property on Fremont, and there are no conditions that I would sell it under. And even later, when she died a year later, I don't think she deeded the church any money. The only thing I can see is that she gave her money to a missionary group. So by late 1925, and this is kind of the end of the period, they wanted to start building their church. Now I'm rounding these numbers because the numbers change in everything you read, but they basically had $35,000. The Lawrence plans to build were in the range of $55,000. And with no mortgage possible, they decided they were going to have to keep to the $35,000 and make alterations to the Lawrence plan. And this is, I'm sorry these are unreadable, but the major change they made was to get rid of the brick, to have a concrete building with stucco on the outside and furring and plaster on the inside. And they were able to save a ton doing that. The other thing was that all of our beautiful wood is fir, and the plans were originally with Lawrence were mahogany. But I kind of like, I mean, do we have mahogany trees here? I kind of like it that it's fir, because it's, Northwest, it's Oregon. And Patty Tillett, our esteemed architect, told me that I was asking him about earthquake with this church. I know that brick buildings have to have things done to them for earthquaking. He said, this church isn't going anywhere. So I believe that, and I quit worrying about it. So they started building the church in 1925, and by 1926 it was done. First service was in January. This is a picture of Bishop's Sumner dedicating the church on January 23rd. And then we found this picture just recently. This is the first wedding at Grace. And I think the sepia tones and everything is just so romantic. So I've brought a lot of the documents. We've got polyester archive sleeves at their ends, so they're perfectly good to look at if you want to read any more of these. The letter from Lawrence describing what a wreck the Universalist Church was on 24th and Broadway. There's some fun things. So I'm going to turn this over to Kathy Gibson to finish up. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Thank you. This is for...
Okay, I need something to hold on to here, but that's okay. Am I close enough? Okay, when we look at people in history, it's really hard to see much about their personalities. We know that Angeline was a strong woman. She donated money to buy the land to build a new church. She was involved in a lot of the women's ministries, but she had very little power within the church because, women were not yet allowed to be on the vestry. So she did not have a vote. But she stood her ground when it came to changing the voting on the property deed. So we were recently delighted to find a newspaper clipping that was in a box of papers that Marianne found when she was cleaning out her office. And the article is what we believe to be from the Sunday Oregonian in 1913. And it's a lesson on dating and sourcing things that you're saving, because there was no date on these. And it kind of gives us a glimpse into Angeline's personality and shows her to be a woman after my own heart. So I'm going to read the article. It's a little hard because the sentences, thank you, in older newspapers are really long with a lot of commas. And so bear with me. Despite her 70 years and 10, Mrs. F.W. Berry of 600 East Oak Street is an enthusiastic motorist. She owns her own car and drives it everywhere about the city, weaving skillfully through the crowded traffic of the downtown district, or indulging in an exhilarating bit of swift speeding when the way is clear out on some of the smooth, hard-surfaced avenues in the residence districts. Mrs. Berry is several months past 70 years of age, but in her youthfulness of spirit and the sweet wholesomeness of her kindly and sympathetic outlook on life, she has retained a buoyancy and an energy that would do credit to a woman of less than half her age. Just recently, she returned, it's 1913, from a journey around the world, a remarkable feat in itself for one of her age, since she went unaccompanied and negotiated all the difficulties of the trip by herself. The tour was made entirely for pleasure, and Mrs. Berry traveled in a leisurely way, taking in all the important points of interest and enjoying every minute of the trip. She returned by way of Japan and spent many delightful weeks traveling in the Orient. While abroad, she made many side trips by automobile, and she found a delight in traveling by the luxurious medium of the motor, that she determined to purchase a car for herself upon return to Portland and to learn to operate it. This she lost no time in doing, and within a fortnight after arriving in her home city, she had selected a spick and span Babcock. Did that do it? Oh, there it is. Spick and span Babcock Electric, and was busily engaged in learning how to drive it. With the buoyant enthusiasm that had been so characteristic of all that she had done in her long and useful life, Mrs. Berry quickly mastered the task that she had set herself, and in a short time was skillfully driving her smart motor everywhere about the city, picking up invalid friends and taking them for afternoon errands, or whisking some over-engrossed matron and mother away from her too earnest domesticity for an hour or so of refreshing recreation. Mrs. Berry never missed a fine day and seldom goes alone for her outings in her swift little motor. She is of that unselfish type who finds pleasure doubled when it is shared with someone else. And she is greatly loved for all her thoughtfulness and consideration by all who knew her. The I'm in my 70s, so I should know this word, septuagenarian motorist is an active member and officer in the Oregon Humane Society, which, by the way, she founded. So she loved dogs. And is prominently identified with church work. Through her personal efforts and her generous individual endowment funds, through her individual endowment funds were raised for the building of Grace Memorial Episcopal Church in Irvington as a memorial to her deceased husband, Frank W. Berry, who was one of Oregon's respected pioneers. Mrs. Berry is president of the Women's Auxiliary connected with the church and an energetic worker in that organization, besides being active in the affairs of the Humane Society. And they are both buried in Lone Pine Cemetery, if some of you know where that is. It's a fun cemetery to walk through if you haven't been there. So back to Nancy.
If Kevin was here, he'd call this meeting to a close, but if you have any questions, we could try to answer them. Lone Fir Cemetery, and they give tours in the summer. I mean, they are fascinating. It was, it was a piece of land, and a guy was buried there. It was his land, and then other people started to be buried there. And they have a tour of like famous women at Lone Fir, and Angelina's on that tour. We went on one this summer, and gosh, it's really interesting. They buried the Chinese people there, and just shallow graves, and then not in coffins or anything, and then they dug them up and sent their bones back to China. Oh, is it? Yeah. And they have all sorts of different tours, and they're just great fun. You'd learn a lot. It's just over on, where is it, you guys? Belmont? But you can look them up online. Friends of Lone Fir Cemetery. Oh, really? Because there's a whole vacant there's a whole vacant area of the cemetery with, they had some kind of garage there for a while, but they tore it down out of respect. Yeah. Yeah? What happened to the mortgage restriction? Nothing. It's still on the deed? Well, they did. It's a pretty old deed. And they did a search. The development people did what do you call those? Title? And it never came up. But it was never lifted that we know of. I mean, Angeline died a year after. She died in 1920, so she never lifted it. And we're not going to mortgage this church. I think it was kind of a blessing. The concrete was probably the same thing. I don't know. But I'll tell you, that Lawrence Church was spectacular. It was really gorgeous. Yes? the only thing that talks about that is a letter from Nettie Parks in 1976. She was living at Holiday Park, and she had a memory from 1908 that she went to a meeting and that there was this talk of a baby Grace. That is the only thing. And from what I know about memories from when you're young, I know that my sisters are all wrong, and mine are all right. Because we just don't think that he had a daughter, but she became a missionary in Central America, and she came here and talked to the women of grace. So I guess amongst the four of us, we came to the conclusion that that was a bad memory because it is supported in nothing that we could find. A legend. Kirsten, did you have a question? Oh, Yutundi. I'm not going to be able to hear you. Let me get back there. Yutundi asked me a question that I was supposed to talk about, how this can maybe be inspiration for us in our development. Because in 1908, these people had an idea. And in 1926, they had this church. And there were tons of obstacles that we didn't have enough time to talk about along the way. So I guess the lesson would be that if you have a vision, just keep at it. I mean, I've been through several visions myself. Paul's been through visions. But I think the other part of that is, at the end, you just have to be practical. What can you really afford? I mean, they were, and they got this. So I think you just come down to saying, how much money do we have? How much can we do with that money? And then make it happen. You're welcome. Is that it? Kate. There were at that time a lot of memorial churches, and this church is laden with memorials, and we could do a whole talk on that. Like all these windows are memorials to people. That cross up there is a memorial to Oswald Taylor. The parish hall is a memorial to Oswald Taylor. We've got the Finley Library, we've got Mason Burnham Room. We found his picture. He was in the Vietnam War and was missing, and I think they finally were able to bring his remains home. But we found his picture the other day, and we went, oh, this is Mason Burnham. But this church is, the benches are memorials, and it was a thing back then. And for our 100-year anniversary, she so wanted a memorial in the church to Frederick. And I think maybe there was a little irritation towards the end, but I sure would like us to do that for the 100-year memorial, to finally put Frederick's plaque up. Maybe back there I've been. So, anything else? Sally. I tell people it's great fun to immerse yourself in things that are finished. Because our lives today are so kind of uncertain, like what direction is this all going to go in? The story isn't told. And that just gives me so much anxiety that I just go down to the basement and I read the old vestry ledgers, calms me right down. So thanks, you guys. You were just the best audience. I really appreciate it. And if you're interested in documents, I've got some up here.